Writer, teacher, and cultural critic Bell Hooks says in her book, Teaching to Turn Stress, that to engage in dialogue is one of the simplest ways we can begin as teachers, scholars, and critical thinkers to cross boundaries, the barriers that may or may not be erected by race, gender, class, professional standing, and a host of other differences. Like Bell Hooks says, dialogue is crucial to our development as educators. And it's one of the things that's going to push us to cross racial and cultural boundaries. I'm Jane Marie Hutchison, and today I'm going to share with you how I explored the role of dialogue as I created a professional development curriculum in my school for my Master's of Education program. I teach full-time at an international school in New York, and today I'm going to tell you about my research question, the resulting professional development curriculum that I created, and my analysis after facilitating the curriculum with educators at my school. Over my years teaching in different elementary schools and coming to grad school and taking graduate classes, I've read a lot of research about how white teachers need to receive appropriate training for working with our increasingly diverse population in the United States. But this year, I began to think about my own school, where there's predominantly white staff teaching a predominantly white demographic of students. And I thought about how these teachers also need to have this training. They need to have professional development to help them become anti-bias educators, anti-racist educators, anti-oppressive, working within this anti-oppressive framework. So because my interest was in professional development for white educators in predominantly white spaces, the purpose of my project was to explore how might professional development in predominantly white spaces engage educators with anti-bias and social justice teaching. Within this inquiry, I wanted to explore the role of dialogue in teacher learning. I wanted to explore the identity and the culture of the educators engaging in the anti-bias teaching. And also I wanted to critique the racial and socio-political context of US schools. So for my master's project, I created a professional development curriculum. I'm going to refer to it as a PD for this aforementioned school, which again, it's a predominantly white school with a predominantly white student body. What's more, it's an international school. So knowing this, I knew that a lot of the staff coming from Western European countries would have a different context for race and for gender, and their experiences with race were going to be different than the American staff. So I created the PD curriculum with this context in mind. So I used three theoretical frameworks. I used culturally relevant pedagogy, critical race theory, and whiteness studies. I situated my PD with a mindset that educators need to know and understand their own identity. They need to become culturally competent by learning about themselves and their culture and other cultures, and that they need to develop critical consciousness, the ability to question, critique, and push back on the socio-political environment. These are critical for a teacher's ability to teach with an anti-bias lens and teach these social justice standards to our students. I also relied on critical race theory and the belief that racism is normal and pervasive in our society. These theoretical frameworks guided the creation of my curriculum. So my curriculum pulled from existing resources, the Teaching Tolerance Social Justice Standards. Teaching Tolerance is a website for educators. It provides anti-bias and social justice resources for the classroom. I use the social justice standards. This is the logo of what it looks like when you go to the website. The social justice standards have 4 domains. The domains are identity, diversity, justice, and action. They were written with students in mind, and they were meant to be taught throughout a K-12 context throughout the schooling years. But my question was, how do you jump from teach these standards to your students in your classroom without ever really having a firm understanding of what we mean when we say social justice, when we say identity, diversity, justice, and action? And I was aware that talking about topics like race and gender, bias, discrimination could be new and confusing for our international staff. So knowing this, I adapted the teaching tolerance curriculum into a PD for the educators, rather than being the standards for students. So my PD went through these 4 domains. We went through identity, diversity, justice, and action, but with the lens of ourselves as educators. Over the period of several weeks, we did this. Each week, we explored a different domain through different activities that I designed through the standards, but also Louise Derman Sparks' book on anti-bias education. And I asked the educators participating in the PD to think critically about their own identity, to think about their experiences with diversity. And then when we got to the justice domain, I asked them to think about their experiences with bias, with prejudice, with stereotypes and discrimination. And when we got to the last domain, action, we asked each other, what will we do when we see injustice? And how can we and how should we respond? And we talked about being an ally. We talked about, as a school, what should we do? What could we do? So after I did this curriculum with some educators at my school, I conducted an analysis on my findings. My analysis focuses on the way that professional development is perceived, as well as how time affects the continuing development of educators. First, the bureaucratic system of schooling and the way that we view schools creates, in the way we view time, creates a lack of space for conversations and professional development sessions around these topics of diversity and anti-bias teaching. Building on this theme, I'm going to problematize the notion that what we do in professional development needs to be productive and worthy of our time. And finally, because becoming an anti-bias educator requires continuous development, it's imperative that the self-reflection and critique that goes along with this work becomes both familiar and commonplace in our schools. So the issue of time and resources emerged as a major theme throughout this curriculum. Because of the way professional development works within the bureaucratic system of my school, when I began facilitating the curriculum, I led the first session on identity, it was that first domain, to the entire staff. It was at a professional development day, and the whole staff was attending. Now, these professional development days are rare, and they don't happen but maybe once, twice throughout the year. So when it came to teaching the other domains, diversity and justice and action, there wasn't a space for me to actually do that for the whole staff. So I ended up going forward saying to my staff, who is interested in learning more about these topics? And I had a self-selected group, a professional learning community of sorts, and they voluntarily participated in my sessions, both digitally and in person. I thought that the participants in my small group would want to participate more digitally because we're busy. It was teachers and administrators who had signed up, but I actually found that the digital engagement was very low, and I instead got the most engagement while we were having these in-person meetings before school. Even though it took up time and it was before our contracted time to be at the school, that was where I got the most engagement. And as I reflected on this finding, I thought about how one of the goals of my professional development curriculum was to create dialogue. And that dialogue took place in person and face-to-face. We were reflecting with one another. We were responding to one another. And at the end of the sessions, when I finished all of this that I was doing for my project, the members of the group said, wait, no, we don't want to stop meeting. We actually want to continue meeting. And we want to meet more, not just with us, but we want the whole staff to talk about this more. And we want these topics to become familiar in our school. So this led me to a few questions. Other feedback I received, one was from an international staff member. She said, okay, actually, the way that we went through this curriculum was too fast for me. I need more time to go through these new terms. They're new to me, and I'm not sure what you mean when you say all of these words, because English isn't my first language. So one question for my analysis is, how do we create, within the bureaucratic system of schools, how do they prevent us from participating in this critique and self-reflection that's required for anti-bias work and teaching? Oops. The reality is that our PD schedule is limited to just a few PD days a year. We have a few meetings before school that cover logistics and curriculum, and the way that we structure school is within this concept of productive time. And that carries over to our PDs. So what we prioritize as an institution, productive time, is actually counterintuitive to this anti-bias work. So this work asks teachers to actually self-reflect, critique, analyze their own lives and experiences, as well as the experiences of others, and have a dialogue among these topics. And that work is a long game. And it takes time that teachers and administrators say, we don't have time for that. Or maybe they say, well, we have this much time for that. So my second question is, how do we demonstrate that these conversations around these topics, they're in fact worthy of our time, even when they don't align with our perception of productivity or come with measurable outcomes? One of the driving ideas behind my curriculum is that we live in a racialized society, and that we live within the reality of our socio-political climate. And there's not a day that we arrive as anti-bias educators or anti-racist educators. Oppression in the form of isms is so embedded in the systems in which we live that this work requires continuous development. So my final question is, how do we make familiar and commonplace the self-reflection and critique that goes along with anti-bias work? Our students, whether they're white and from the culture of power, or they're from minoritized groups, they need to learn about identity, diversity, justice, and action. And so it's an imperative that we as educators create the time and space for teachers to continually have this development, even when it feels counterintuitive to our constructs within school and our school day and school schedule.